thank you for downloading the Food Chain podcast, a weekly helping of the economics, science and culture of food. I'm Emily Thomas. What would you say if I told you something had been added to your food that could affect your health? You can't see it, you won't taste it, and you might not have realised it's there at all. It's been added to solve a nutrient deficiency, just not one that's necessarily yours. In this episode, we're going to be talking about fortification, the practice of adding small amounts of minerals or vitamins to a food to improve its nutritional quality. This may well be affecting you. Governments and the food industry are increasingly adding these micronutrients to our food. Around 90 countries fortify one or more industrially milled cereal grain. And if you use seasoning cubes, drink fruit juice, or eat popular noodle brands or breakfast cereals, then you might just want to take a closer look at the packaging. We'll be speaking to a global food company which is on a mission to fortify more of its processed food, and to one of the main NGOs involved in fortifying staple foods in the developing world. Improving the nutritional quality of our food sounds like a good thing, but who should be doing it? Who really benefits? And has a focus on fortification meant we failed to address the underlying causes of malnutrition? Can we have too much of a good thing? Let's start in the UK, where one of our staple foods comes with some added extras.
My name's Gordon Paulson. I'm the director of the Federation of Bakers, the trade association in the UK that represents the interests of the large bakers who produce typically all the sliced and wrapped bread in the UK. We're here today in London Bread and Cake, which produces lots of different kinds of products in North London. All the bread and rolls and other bakery products which are made from white flour will be fortified. Wholemeal bread, wholemeal products will not be fortified.
And if we go over here, we can see where the flour enters the bakery, a huge pipe.
The flour coming from the large silo outside of the building being pumped through pipes down through this into the mixing bowl.
This looks just like wheat flour to me, but there's something else in there.
The fortificants that are in that flour are calcium, thiamine and niacin and iron. And they're added in very small proportions to the flour. It goes back actually to the Second World War, around about 1942. It was diagnosed that people in the country were suffering from rickets. So lack of calcium in the bones don't grow properly. It was decided that we needed to put calcium in our flour.
But the problem that this was created to address, isn't this all obsolete?
Well, actually, very interestingly, it isn't. There's a committee of the government, and it actually conducted a review as recently as 2012, where they did look at the mandatory fortification of flour and whether it should continue. And they said the case was strongest for calcium, but they also thought that taking away the niacin and the thiamine would actually also be more detrimental to the poorest members of society. So the conclusion was quite clearly that the benefits of fortifying flour were there and it should continue.
So what we've got here is bread being sliced before it gets packaged and sent to the shops. We can see a well-known household brand in the UK, lots of trays of it here. Yeah. If we just look at some of the packaging, it doesn't say anywhere obvious that this bread has got calcium, iron, thiamine.
The ingredients of the bread are obviously clearly marked as they are by law. And the first item on the ingredients list is wheat, and it says flour with added calcium, iron, niacin, thiamine.
Do you think the average consumer realises they're getting calcium from their bread?
They probably don't, no. I think it's probably a fair comment. The reason why you can't promote that in a typical loaf like this is to do with nutrition and health claims. You can't claim something on a particular loaf that's not different from any other loaf.
Gordon Paulson there. Most mandatory fortification involves the addition of iron, folic acid, niacin, riboflavin and thiamine to wheat, rice or maize. But in some countries there's a legal requirement to fortify milk, cereal-based products, fats and oils. The other type of food fortification is voluntary, meaning it's at the discretion of the food manufacturer to add nutrients from a government-approved list. For some, this can be problematic. Mark Lawrence is Professor in Public Health Nutrition at Deakin University in Australia.
50 years ago, there were few countries around the world where you would get more than a handful of products that had been fortified, certainly on a voluntary basis. There's just been a proliferation of voluntary fortification in terms of the number of nutrients that are being added to foods, as well as the range of foods that are being added. And similarly, the rollout of mandatory fortification has just gone up tremendously. It's just been incredible, the exposure of the world's population to nutrients through fortification interventions.
So we've seen food fortification rise along with the rise of processed food.
It's a great irony, isn't it, that purportedly the fortification is occurring for health benefits, and yet if it's displacing nutritious whole foods from the diet, it seems to be a little bit of a mixed blessing, putting it mildly. And it's a double problem when the vehicle for carrying the fortificant might be a breakfast cereal that's really high in sugar or salt or whatever, but it's positioned or marketed as a particularly healthy food because it's got half a dozen different nutrients in it. So when it's exploited sort of cynically at times for marketing, I think the benefits pale against the risks. You have to ask the question, is there any need for this in the first place? Many high-income countries are, if anything, overexposed to nutrients and certainly energy.
But what might happen to you physically if you have too much vitamin D or too much folic acid or too much vitamin C? So
a nutrient like vitamin D, it's fairly rare to have toxic levels of vitamin D, but it can happen, and you would raise the level of calcium in your blood. You might just have mild symptoms, you might have fatigue, for example. But, in extreme cases, you can have overcalcification of the bones. Other nutrients, it can be quite acute. I think one of the big success stories with mandatory fortification has been universal salt iodization around the world. It's been very effective in reducing brain damage and growth problems. But it is possible to have excess exposure to iodine, and paradoxically, it can damage the thyroid. That's the purpose of exposure to iodine, to promote the health of the thyroid, so you can have a direct reverse of what you're trying to achieve.
Do we also see private industry having an influence on what gets onto the lists of mandatory and voluntary fortification?
Definitely. I can speak from experience in Australia and New Zealand. When I was involved with the Food Regulatory Agency here, there was a lot of pressure that was put on, at the very highest levels, on health ministers and so on, from certain manufacturers, particularly breakfast cereal manufacturers, to expand the list of approved nutrients that could be added to foods, always on a voluntary basis. And the way that the issue was resolved eventually was to change the rationale for making the decision. Previously, the rationale had been that there was a requirement for evidence of a public health need to permit that addition of the nutrient. And it changed to there had to be evidence of harm to prevent it being added onto the list. So the onus shifted from the manufacturer to the agency to demonstrate risk.
So it's kind of innocent till proven guilty now?
That's a good way of describing it.
Could we talk specifically about DSM, because they're the biggest company involved in manufacturing nutrients in the world? Well, what might be their influence over what ends up on fortification lists?
We had an experience recently in Australia where it created a precedent, as far as I'm aware. It wasn't a food manufacturer that was seeking voluntary fortification of their products. It was actually DSM. Their application to the regulator was to add vitamin D to ready-to-eat breakfast cereals. I would add the other critical factor here is food is a very complex entity. There are many nutrients in foods. There's interactions among the nutrients in the food. Dietary patterns is an increasingly important area. So I think it's quite naive or perhaps misinformed to think that by adding a few specific nutrients into foods, often which aren't that healthy in the first place, is somehow or other going to make it all okay for a healthy, balanced diet.
Mark Lawrence. Well, let's have a look at one of these products that's been fortified by a food manufacturer, the Maggi brand of seasoning cube produced by Nestlé. It's sold in many parts of the world, including 21 countries in Africa, and for some it's a cooking staple. The food chain sent Sammy Darko to give you a flavour in Ghana's capital, Accra.
Business is brisk here at the Medina Market in Accra. Dozens of people, so many things on display here. Over there is a chain of traders who sell a variety of seasonings, including dissolvable cubes. The brands include Maggi, Royco, Jumbo, and Onga. Almost a decade ago, I was in a similar market selling Jumbo cubes to these traders on tabletops. I never enjoyed the job because many customers preferred Maggi cube over my product, Jumbo cube. That yellow brand was an already established product through riveting advertisements and rewards for consumers. Good afternoon, Dorcas.
Good afternoon, Sammy.
I have come to the home of Dorcas Dankwa. She's a banker. Dorcas has just returned from the market and is about preparing an evening meal for the family.
I'm preparing fufu with light soup.
Fufu is a starchy paste which you're going to eat with soup.
It's made of garden eggs and tomatoes and onions. There's Maggi.
Maggi, and the flavor is shrimp.
Shrimp.
So Maggi shrimp, okay. How many of the Maggi cubes do you use, say, in a week?
About 3.
Garlic, ginger, beef, onion, and tomatoes are what are being used to prepare this soup. Dorcas tells me that Maggi's health claims are one of the reasons she buys the brand.
This one has in it some source of vitamin.
So, Dorcas, without this Maggi cube, how were you making up for the nutritional balancing of your food?
I use garlic and onions for it, but the Maggi cube is a top-up for me to add taste to it as well, in addition to the nutritional value it gives.
Like Dorcas, many people here use Maggi in cooking at home, but perhaps the biggest users are those who cook at the eateries in the country. However, not everyone likes the cube. Audrey Forson is the CEO of Tekura, producers of handcrafted furniture and decor items.
When I started cooking a long time ago, I was using it, but I noticed buying food from outside, they use too much Maggi, and so there was a pungent smell I couldn't stand. Then again, as you grow, you realize you need to live healthy. So my entire family moved more into organic food. So we're doing more of the greens, garlic, ginger, onions. And so we don't have need for the Maggi anymore.
But are you aware that Maggi cube, for instance, is fortified with vitamins?
Yes, but if I can get vitamins directly from fruits and vegetables, why should I go for a processed product? If you go direct to the source of your vitamins, you are safer.
Nestlé says its research shows many populations are not getting all the vitamins and minerals they need. It fortifies many products, including cereals, soups, noodles and seasonings, and it's on a drive to do more. But why? Looking at a bag of Maggi cubes I can buy here in the UK, the main ingredients are salt, sugar and flavourings. The front of the packet tells me they're a source of iodine and a source of iron. But Wayne England, Senior Vice President of the Global Strategy Unit at Nestlé, told me marketing is not the aim of fortification.
We don't sell to push fortification. We want to help people eat more homemade food. And we believe that the noodles and the cubes especially can play a big role in that. We don't put fortification to be the selling proposition.
So what you're saying is that with your fortified foods, you don't use the fortification as a marketing point. We're not going to see on a packet of noodles with extra vitamin.
You will see. Yeah, we believe in transparency, so you will see it. Okay?
But is that transparency or is that marketing? Is it a selling point?
It is a selling point in the fact that from a transparency perspective, we believe the consumer has the right and should know when the product is fortified and when it is not. But I just want to stress that in our philosophy, the basic reason of fortification is not that you choose us because of fortification. You choose us because it fits into your daily diet and meal, and it's fortified so it's better for you.
What is your reason for fortifying food then? You're not doing it because it will make consumers choose your product. You're not doing it to make money. You're doing it because...
Yeah, look, as I said, I think that we are in the business to provide cooking aids to help people unlock their potential to make homemade food. This is our way of being more competitive and making a better business. But we don't start from the primary reason of looking at deficiencies to launch products.
Would you say that instant noodles are a homemade food, though? Are they the right vehicle to be fortifying?
Noodles is not the most homemade food as a scratched cook meal, but it's a better alternative than a packet of crisps or some other alternatives that people might have. And we often encourage the addition of other vegetables to a noodle dish. This then we call homemade.
Is fortification a way of justifying a food that isn't very healthy?
I would say no, because we fortify because we see the overall deficiencies of the diet, and the frequency of the consumption of noodles can play a role together to help improve the daily intake. We don't fortify to overcome what we think is bad.
For the consumer, you could argue, once you start fortifying the foods that are processed, everything gets a bit confused. And do we risk getting messages out there to people? They think, you know what, it's fine, I'm just going to eat instant noodles. They've got added vitamins and minerals.
We primarily start from what you're saying, encouraging people to cook with homemade food based on intrinsic raw materials. But we know from research, our own research with the World Health Organization, that there are deficiencies in the countries that we operate in, and that we, through the high frequency of our products, can be effective in helping overcome deficiencies.
Do you then do studies once you've addressed those problems to see what kind of impact the changes you've made have had?
There's many other people also fortifying products in the market, so we don't know always exactly what comes from our product, and governments are also fortifying. How we can trace that back to our individual product is what I said is contextually very difficult.
Wayne England there. You're listening to The Food Chain on the BBC World Service with me, Emily Thomas. And this week we're talking about fortification, the adding of micronutrients to what we eat. We've been hearing about how companies choose to fortify processed foods. Next, we're going to look at what international agencies and charities have been doing to increase the fortification of staple foods in developing countries. The World Health Organization sees food fortification as an important strategy for tackling micronutrient malnutrition. Deficiencies of iron, iodine, vitamin A, folate and zinc can lead to disease and disability, especially in children. But critics say fortification was intended as a short-term solution to address the problem decades ago, and its proliferation means there hasn't been enough focus on tackling the underlying causes of malnutrition. Barry Maggetts is Emeritus Professor within Medicine at the University of Southampton in the UK.
Gradually, what became a short-term solution switched around to become the solution. And gradually, agencies stopped talking about the food systems and started to focus on supplementation and fortification as the strategy to solve the nutrition problems. On all of the literature from people that support this approach, they always say, of course, we should be improving the food supply, but this is difficult and we don't have enough money. So we've got to give children supplements and we've got to go for fortification. So alongside this push for having supplements and fortification, the political support for bottom-up, community-based approaches was weakened because governments didn't really want to think about or address the underlying reasons why poor people were not having access to the resources to be able to eat healthy, varied diets. So this has enabled and been driven by Bill and Melinda Gates money and a number of other private philanthropic organizations which are very keen on top-down magic bullet sort of interventions, which have given money to do these primarily fortification type interventions. By focusing on just one nutrient, we're not focusing on the other nutrients. We're taking resources away. So if we look, for example, at iron, only about half the anemia in the world is actually caused by iron deficiency. There are lots of other reasons why people have anemia. So if we're putting all our effort into putting iron in a very few number of foods, and we're not addressing all those other causes, sanitation, improving access to fruits and vegetables, all the other things that we know are important, we're not actually helping address the problem. And there's an ideology to it. People don't want to think about and address the underlying poverty and social determinants of health because it gets into politics. It gets into the complex, messy world of why people are poor. The people that are hungry, who are smallholders and small farmers, they need access to resources to produce more diverse diets. They need access to better infrastructure to sell their produce. These are simple, basic things.
And is part of your argument here that if efforts are being put into fortifying food, they're not being put elsewhere into things like making sure we have sustainable food systems?
2/3 of the world's food is produced by smallholders growing food on less than 2 hectares of land. The biggest problem is much of that is wasted because they can't access local markets. If we could improve access to markets, if we could improve better credit so that smallholders could diversify their production, it would be a better investment for local communities than investing in complex systems which actually help bigger businesses to make better profits.
Well, that's how it looks to Barry Magetz. Let's get another view on this. The Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN for short, is an international NGO which calls itself the global leader in large-scale food fortification and works to fortify staple foods such as flour and oil. It says its fortification programmes have reached 800 million people in more than 30 countries. Their executive director is Lawrence Haddad. The organisation says it's driven by the vision of a world without malnutrition, and I asked Lawrence if fortification is their main focus.
It has been for the last 15 years. The next 10 years it's going to be, I would say, about a third of our focus, because there's a massive unfinished agenda. So, everywhere should be fortified because it's a really key intervention. But the other 2/3 will be really working elsewhere in the food system to make sure our food systems in the 10 countries we work in, at least, really work for nutrition. At the moment, they essentially work for profit.
Are you able to give us any figures or evidence for the impact of your food fortification work?
Yeah, we are. I mean, the benefit cost ratios are 6 to 9. That means for every dollar you spend on fortification, you get between 6 and 9 back in terms of reduced spending on health and improved economic productivity. Those benefit cost ratios are very competitive to other things that governments could spend their money on, like bridges and roads.
You're talking about cost and benefit ratios, and that sounds very impressive, but isn't this short-term thinking? Because, OK, you can spend this money now and you're going to see some return for what you've spent, but you're not addressing the underlying causes of poverty and malnutrition.
Yes, ideally, we'd want everybody in the world to be eating a healthy diet. We'd want everybody in the world to have enough income. We'd want all women in the world to be sufficiently empowered to buy the right kind of food. We'd want that food to be available and affordable. But we're not there yet. So what do you do? What's your choice? Is your choice to say, sorry, kids, the third of kids that die from malnutrition, sorry, we're working on the underlying determinants, so you can die while we're doing that? Or do you establish a floor in a high benefit cost way and say, look, this is taking very few resources away from fixing the underlying resources? Let me give you some numbers, because numbers are really important. The international donors spend about $1 billion a year on nutrition programs, and a very small fraction of that is on food fortification. There's another $5 billion a year that is spent on agriculture, water and sanitation, food systems. The challenge for everybody is to make that $5 billion that the donors spend much more effective at reducing the underlying determinants of nutrition, and that's exactly what GAIN is doing in the food system.
When we look at the people on your board, and we've got someone from a sugar company, someone from a biscuit company, people on your board have commercial interests. Is there not a tension there when you have people involved in making the ingredients that go into fortified food, involved in setting the agenda for what your organisation does?
Well, the agenda is set for our organisation by hundreds of people. We've just gone through a strategy process, and we reached out to 200 experts in the field. But on a project-by-project basis, our board doesn't interfere in what we do. They set a broad strategic goal for us. They make sure that we're doing the things we should be doing to reach that goal. But they all sign conflict of interest statements. Our view is that you have to work with the big companies if you want to change the way they behave. There's an African expression that says, if you want to change somebody's head, they've got to be in the room.
Earlier in the programme, we heard a criticism of the area you work in, that there's just a very few people ultimately at the top shaping the whole agenda with a neoliberal top-down approach.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, nutrition's a very ideological space. And I think the nutrition and business space has unfortunately been captured by two groups of people who I think are really quite small proportion of the people involved, but they're very noisy and very loud. And I would say there's a group of people who thinks businesses do everything better. They're smarter, they have more resources, they're just cleverer. Then I think there's a group that think business really has no business in nutrition. They're evil, they don't do anything sensible. And then I think there's a big group of people in the middle, and this is the silent majority, that think we're never going to achieve the sustainable development goals without business pulling its weight. So we have to involve businesses, and actually they're already involved. 80% of the world's food is purchased through food markets, and more of it is packaged. So we have to engage with them. The question is how, when, and why, and where.
Lawrence Haddad. How, why, when, and where. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so let us know using the hashtag BBC Food Chain. And if you'd like to hear more about fortification, listen back to our fertility food episode from last year, where we talk about folate. You can search for it on your podcast app. For now, from me, Emily Thomas, and editor Marie Keyworth, thanks for listening, and join us again for The Food Chain next week.